The storm came down from the northern peaks like a living thing made of ice and wind and fury. Jack had seen many storms in his 15 years on Titan's Peak, but this one was different. The snow fell so thick that his cameras could not see through it, and the wind howled so loud that it drowned out the sound of his generators. He sealed the outer doors of his fortress and settled in to wait for the weather to pass, but his proximity alarms would not stay quiet. Something was moving out there in the storm, and it was big enough to trigger his sensors. Despite the interference from the wind and snow, Jack checked his displays and saw heat signatures that did not look like the mountain animals that sometimes wandered near his home. These shapes were too regular and too warm to be natural. Jack pulled on his heavy coat and boots and grabbed his rifle before stepping out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and the wind tried to knock him off his feet. Snow stung his face and made it hard to see more than a few meters ahead. He followed the signals from his motion sensors and climbed down the rocky slope toward whatever had triggered his alarms. The crashed ship lay wedged between two large boulders about half a kilometer from his fortress. It was a human transport shuttle, but it had been badly damaged by weapons fire, and the crash landing had made things worse. Burn marks from alien energy weapons scarred the hull, and one engine was completely gone. Jack could see why it had not been able to stay in the air long enough to reach a proper landing site. He forced open the twisted door of the shuttle and found 3 people inside. A woman lay unconscious in the pilot's seat with blood running down her face from a deep cut above her left eye. 2 children huddled together in the passenger compartment and stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. The boy looked to be about 10 years old, and the girl was younger, maybe 6 or 7. All 3 of them wore the simple clothes of colony settlers, and all 3 looked like they had not eaten properly in days. The woman stirred when Jack checked her pulse and opened her eyes to look at him. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that he could barely hear over the storm. Jack leaned closer and caught the words she was trying to say. Haven Colony was gone. The aliens had come back. Her husband was dead. The children needed help. Jack looked at the 2 scared faces watching him and made a decision that surprised him more than anyone. He could have left them in the shuttle to wait out the storm. He could have given them some supplies and directions to the nearest human settlement. He could have done what the lonely mountain man had always done and avoided getting involved in other people's problems. Instead, he gathered the woman carefully in his arms and told the children to stay close to him as they climbed back up the slope to his fortress. The boy, whose name was Danny, helped his little sister Lisa walk through the deep snow. Jack had to stop several times to rest because carrying an injured person up a mountain in a blizzard was hard work even for someone as strong as he was. Inside his fortress, Jack laid the woman on his own bed and used his medical supplies to clean and bandage her wounds. She had lost a lot of blood and had a concussion from hitting her head when the shuttle crashed, but she would live if he could keep her warm and get some medicine into her. The children sat quietly in the corner and watched everything he did with the serious expressions of kids who had seen too much trouble already. The boy Danny was the first to speak when his mother was breathing steadily and seemed out of immediate danger. He told Jack that his name was Danny Santos and his little sister was Lisa, and their mother was Maria. Their father had been Dr. Peter Santos, who worked with alien biology at Haven Colony until the monsters came and killed everyone. They had escaped in the shuttle, but it had been damaged in the attack, and they had been flying for 3 days looking for a safe place to land. Lisa did not say anything, but she moved closer to Jack when he knelt down to check on her. She was not injured like her mother, but she was scared and hungry and tired. Jack found some of his emergency food supplies and heated them up for the children to eat. It was simple food made for long-term storage, but it was better than anything they had eaten since escaping from their destroyed home. As the storm raged outside, Jack found himself doing things he had not done in 15 years. He talked to other people and listened to their problems. He shared his food and his warm shelter. He worried about someone other than himself. The children were polite and quiet, but they watched everything he did with curious eyes. Danny asked questions about his equipment, and Lisa smiled when he showed her the hydroponic gardens where fresh vegetables grew under artificial lights. Maria woke up during the night and panicked when she did not recognize where she was. Jack had to calm her down and explain that she was safe in his mountain fortress. She cried when she remembered what had happened to her colony and her husband, but she thanked Jack for saving her children. He brought her some hot soup and told her to rest while he kept watch over all of them. For the first time in 15 years, Jack Morrison was not alone in his mountain home. The silence that had been his constant companion was broken by the soft breathing of sleeping children and the quiet voice of their mother, asking if they were really safe here. He told her they were as safe as he could make them, and he meant it. Something had changed in him when he saw those scared faces in the crashed shuttle. Something that had been frozen for 15 years was starting to warm up again. The storm finally passed near dawn and left the mountain covered in fresh snow that sparkled in the early light. Jack stood at his observation window and looked out at a world that seemed different somehow. His fortress was no longer just a place where one man hid from the universe. It was a home where a family could heal and grow strong again. Jack did not know what that meant for his carefully ordered life, but he found that he was not afraid to find out. Jack Morrison stood at the edge of his mountain fortress and watched the twin suns of New Terra rise over the distant valleys. The light caught the metal panels of his defense towers and threw long shadows across the rocky ground where he had built his home 15 years ago. He had chosen this place because no one could find him here and no one would bother to look. The mountain called Titan's Peak was too high and too cold for most people to want to live on it. His home was not like the houses that most people built. Jack had carved rooms directly into the rock of the mountain and covered them with steel plates that could stop laser fire from alien ships. Power came from deep inside the mountain, where the rocks were hot enough to boil water and turn generators that gave him all the electricity he needed. Food grew in glass boxes under bright lights that copied the sun. Water came from snow that melted and ran through pipes he had built into the mountain walls. Every morning, Jack walked the same path around his fortress and checked the same things. The sensors that watched the sky for ships that did not belong there were working fine. The guns that could shoot down anything that flew too close were loaded and ready. The radio that listened to messages from far away was picking up the usual chatter from human colonies, but nothing from the aliens who had killed his friends so many years ago. Jack had been a soldier once, and a good one too. He knew how to build things and how to break them. He knew how to fight and how to hide. But most of all, he knew how to be alone, because being alone meant staying alive. The last time he had trusted other people to watch his back, they had all died in a place called the Zephyrian Fields, and he had been the only one to come home. After that day, he had decided that he would never let anyone else die because of him, and he would never have to watch friends turn into smoke and blood again. The other human colonies knew about the man who lived on Titan's Peak, but they thought he was just a story that people told to make themselves feel better. They said there was a ghost in the mountains who shot down alien scouts and left no trace behind. They said he had weapons that could punch holes through battleships and sensors that could see through space itself. Some of it was true and some of it was bigger than the truth, but Jack liked it that way. Stories kept people from coming to look for him. His daily routine never changed, because changing things meant making mistakes, and mistakes meant dying. After checking his defenses, Jack would work on his machines or tend his garden or read the technical manuals he had collected over the years. He had books about every kind of weapon and shield and engine that humans had ever built. He had star charts that showed where every human colony was located and where the alien territories began. He had medical supplies that could fix almost any injury and food that would last for decades without spoiling. The radio crackled with voices from the colonies most days. People talking about weather and crops and children being born and old folks dying. Sometimes there were warnings about alien ships seen near the border worlds, but those ships never came close enough to Titan's Peak for Jack to worry about them. The aliens had learned to stay away from human space after the last war ended. At least that was what most people believed. Jack knew better than most people that aliens never really gave up. They just waited and planned and built stronger ships while humans grew soft and forgot how to fight. Every few months, his long-range sensors would pick up something moving in the dark spaces between stars. Ships that were too big and too quiet to be human vessels. They never came close enough for him to get a clear look at them, but they were out there, watching and waiting for the right time to attack again. The afternoon brought clouds and wind that howled through the peaks around his mountain home. Jack worked inside his workshop, where he built the small machines that kept his fortress running. Repair robots that could fix broken equipment while he slept. Communication devices that could reach across the galaxy. Weapons that most people had never seen before and would never need to see if Jack did his job right. As darkness fell, Jack made his evening rounds and checked that all his systems were working properly. The thermal generators were running at full power. The defense grid was scanning the sky for threats. The food gardens were growing well under their artificial lights. Everything was exactly as it should be in his perfectly ordered world, where no one could hurt him and he could not hurt anyone else. Jack ate his dinner alone, as he had for 15 years. The same simple food that kept him healthy and strong. The same metal cup that held water from his mountain springs. The same table where he sat and listened to the wind outside his steel walls. Sometimes he would turn on the radio and listen to voices from the colonies, but tonight, he let the silence fill his home like it always did. Before sleep, Jack stood once more at his observation window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there in the vast darkness were worlds where humans lived and worked and raised families. Somewhere else in that same darkness were aliens who wanted to kill every human they could find. Jack had chosen to stand between those two groups of beings, and he would keep standing there until he died, or until the aliens stopped coming. That was his job and his burden and his choice. The mountain fortress settled into its nightly routine as automated systems took over the tasks that Jack performed during the day. Sensors swept the sky and space around New Terra. Generators hummed with steady power. Defense weapons stayed ready to fire at anything that did not belong in human space. And Jack Morrison slept the light sleep of a soldier, who knew that danger could come at any moment but believed he was ready for whatever tomorrow might bring to his lonely mountain home. The days that followed brought changes to Titan's Peak that Jack had never imagined possible. Maria grew stronger each day as her injuries healed, and she began to move around the fortress without needing help. Danny explored every room and corridor with the fearless curiosity of a boy who had found the most interesting place in the galaxy. Lisa followed Jack everywhere he went and asked endless questions about everything she saw. Jack discovered that having other people in his home meant changing routines that had stayed the same for 15 years. He could not check his weapons at dawn because the children were still sleeping and the noise would wake them. He could not work on his machines late into the night because someone might need his help. He had to cook more food and use more water, and think about whether his activities would disturb the family that had become part of his mountain fortress. At first, these changes annoyed him because Jack had built his entire life around being alone and doing exactly what he wanted when he wanted to do it. But as the weeks passed, he found that he enjoyed having people to talk to and share meals with. Danny was smart and quick to learn about the technical systems that kept the fortress running. Lisa brought laughter and joy to rooms that had been silent for too long. Maria proved to be intelligent and capable, despite the terrible losses she had suffered. Danny showed a natural talent for understanding how machines worked. Jack would explain the basic principles of his defense systems or power generators, and the boy would immediately see connections and possibilities that took most adults years to grasp. When Jack worked on repairs or improvements, Danny would hand him the right tools without being asked, and ask questions that showed he was really thinking about the problems they were solving together. Lisa was different from her serious older brother, but no less remarkable in her own way. She had a gift for noticing small details that everyone else missed, and she could make friends with the automated systems that ran parts of the fortress. The cleaning robots seemed to respond to her voice commands better than they did to Jack's programming. The environmental controls adjusted themselves to keep her comfortable even when she did not ask them to. Maria gradually took over many of the daily tasks that Jack had always done by himself. She was better at cooking than he was, and she knew how to make the stored food taste like real meals instead of just nutrition. She organized his medical supplies and his spare equipment in ways that made everything easier to find. She listened to the radio communications from other colonies and kept track of news and events that Jack had ignored for years. But it was the conversations that changed Jack the most. For 15 years he had lived inside his own thoughts with no one to share his ideas or concerns. Now he found himself talking about things he had never spoken aloud. He told Maria about the aliens he had fought in the Zephyrian Wars and how different they had been from humans. He explained to Danny how human technology worked and why it was often better than what the aliens used. He answered Lisa's questions about the mountain and the animals that lived there and the stars that filled the night sky. Maria told him about life in the human colonies and how people lived and worked and raised their families among the distant worlds that humans had settled. She described Haven Colony as it had been before the attack, with its farms and schools and workshops, where her husband had studied alien creatures that were not hostile to human life. She spoke of friends who had died in the attack and dreams that had been destroyed. When the monsters came from space, The children talked about their father, who had been a scientist and a good man who wanted to learn about aliens so that humans and other species could live together in peace. Danny remembered helping his father collect samples and run experiments. Lisa remembered stories her father told about strange creatures that lived on worlds far from human space. Both children carried their grief quietly, but Jack could see that they were healing a little more each day. Jack began to change his daily routines to include his new family. Instead of eating alone, he shared meals with Maria and the children. Instead of working in silence, he explained what he was doing and listened to their suggestions. Instead of sleeping lightly and alone, he found that the sounds of other people in his home made him feel safer and more relaxed than he had in years. The fortress itself seemed to change as well. Rooms that had been storage areas became bedrooms and play spaces. Equipment that had gathered dust was cleaned and put to new uses. The hydroponic gardens expanded to grow more food and different kinds of plants that the children enjoyed. The communications array began picking up signals that Jack had filtered out before because he had not cared about colony news or personal messages between families. Danny proved to be especially helpful with the technical systems that defended the mountain. He could spot problems that Jack might have missed and suggest improvements that made everything work better. The boy had inherited his father's scientific mind and his mother's practical nature. Jack found himself teaching Danny things about engineering and weapon systems that he had never shared with anyone. Lisa brought a different kind of help by making the fortress feel more like a home and less like a military installation. She decorated the common areas with drawings and crafts made from materials she found around the mountain. She sang songs that filled the corridors with music. She convinced Jack to set up entertainment systems that could play movies and games during the long evenings when storms kept them inside. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Jack realized that he no longer thought of himself as a hermit who lived alone on a mountain. He had become something he had never expected to be again. He was part of a family. These people who had crashed into his life during a snowstorm had given him something more valuable than all the weapons and defenses he had built over the years. They had given him a reason to care about tomorrow and hope that the future might be better than the past. The change was not always easy. Jack still preferred solitude sometimes, and he still worried that caring about other people would make him weak and vulnerable. But when he watched Danny working on a complex problem, or heard Lisa laughing at something funny, or saw Maria smile when she thought no one was watching, he knew that he had found something worth protecting. His mountain fortress was no longer just a place to hide from the universe. It had become a home. The truth about what had destroyed Haven Colony came out slowly as Maria recovered her strength and her memories became clearer. Jack had assumed that the attack was just another raid by one of the alien species that humans had fought before, pirates looking for supplies or territory seekers trying to expand their borders. But Maria's description of the attackers made Jack realize that something far worse had found human space. The aliens that destroyed Haven Colony were different from any species that humans had encountered in previous wars. Maria called them devourers because that was what they did to every world they conquered. They did not want to rule human colonies or steal human technology or enslave human populations. They wanted to consume everything living on a planet and leave nothing behind but dead rock. Floating in space, Maria had seen the attack from the beginning because she had been in the colony's communication center when the first ships appeared. The devourers had not tried to negotiate or demand surrender. They had simply started killing everything they could find. Their weapons did not just destroy buildings and vehicles. They drained the life force from plants and animals and people until entire areas became empty wastelands, where nothing could ever grow again. The few colonists who escaped did so only because Dr. Peter Santos had discovered something important about the devourers during his research. He had been studying tissue samples from alien creatures when he noticed that certain electromagnetic frequencies could damage or destroy the devourer biological components. It was not a complete solution, but it was enough to create weapons that could fight back against the invaders. Peter had managed to send a warning message to other colonies before he died defending the evacuation shuttles. The message contained his research data and instructions for building weapons that could generate the specific EM frequencies that harmed the devourers. But most of the colonies had not believed the warning or had not been able to build the weapons in time to save themselves. Jack listened to Maria's story with growing alarm as he realized the scope of the threat that humanity was facing. The Devourers were not just another alien enemy. They were a species that existed only to consume and destroy. They had already wiped out 12 human colonies, and their massive fleet was moving steadily toward the core systems where billions of humans lived. The intercepted communications that Jack monitored began to make more sense when he understood what he was hearing. Distress calls from colonies that went silent before anyone could respond to them. Military reports about entire systems going dark without explanation. Refugee ships fleeing from attacks that no one could describe, because few people survived to tell what they had seen. Maria had memorized as much of her husband's research as she could during the evacuation from Haven Colony. She knew the exact frequencies that could disrupt Devourer technology, and the power levels needed to make the weapons effective over long distances. But the knowledge was incomplete because Peter had died before he could finish his work. The data existed only in fragments scattered between Maria's memories and the few research files that had been saved from the colony. Jack realized that his mountain fortress was uniquely suited to become a weapon against the Devourers. The geothermal generators that powered his home could produce far more electricity than he normally used. The metal framework built into the mountain could serve as a massive antenna array. The computers that controlled his defense systems were powerful enough to coordinate the complex calculations needed to generate the precise EM frequencies that could destroy Devourer ships. Danny proved invaluable in understanding his father's research and helping Jack translate the theoretical concepts into practical engineering solutions. The boy had inherited Peter's scientific mind and had listened carefully when his father explained his work. Danny could remember details that Maria had forgotten, and he could see connections between different parts of the research that made the overall picture clearer. Even Lisa contributed to their growing understanding of the Devourer threat. She had sharp eyes and a good memory for things that adults might overlook. When Maria was trying to recall specific technical details, Lisa would remember something her father had said or drawn that filled in the missing pieces. The 6-year-old girl became their link to Dr. Peter Santos and his incomplete but vital research. Jack began modifying his fortress to serve as humanity's first effective weapon against the Devourers. The process required tearing apart systems that had protected him for 15 years and rebuilding them for a completely different purpose. Instead of hiding from enemies, he was preparing to announce his presence to every hostile force in the galaxy. Instead of defending just himself, he was taking on the responsibility of protecting the entire human species. The work was dangerous and difficult, and there was no guarantee that it would succeed. Jack had to rewire the power systems to handle energy loads that could easily destroy his mountain if something went wrong. He had to reshape the metal structures that formed his antenna array without triggering avalanches that would bury his fortress. He had to program his computers to perform calculations that pushed them to their absolute limits. Maria served as the coordinator for their efforts because she understood both the scientific principles and the tactical requirements better than anyone else. She organized their work schedules and made sure that every modification was properly tested before they moved on to the next step. She also monitored the communications networks for news about Devourer attacks and tried to warn other colonies about what was coming. As spring turned to summer, their weapon system began to take shape. The mountain itself had become a massive EM generator, capable of producing the specific frequencies that could disrupt Devourer technology. The fortress was no longer just Jack's hidden home. It was humanity's secret weapon in a war that most people did not even know they were fighting. But Jack knew that building the weapon was only the first step. The Devourers were still out there consuming human worlds and moving closer to the core systems every day. Soon they would come to New Terra, and when they did, Jack would have to choose between the safety of his mountain fortress and the survival of his species. The lonely mountain man who had spent 15 years avoiding responsibility for anyone but himself was about to become the most important defender of human civilization. The family that had crashed into his life during a snowstorm had given him more than companionship and purpose. They had given him the knowledge and motivation he needed to stand against an enemy that threatened to devour everything he had learned to care about. Jack Morrison was no longer hiding from the universe. He was preparing to save it. The decision to fight changed everything about life on Titan's Peak. Jack had spent 15 years building a fortress designed to hide from enemies, and now he was transforming it into a beacon that would announce humanity's defiance to every hostile force in the galaxy. The work required dismantling defense systems that had kept him safe and rebuilding them for a purpose that might get them all killed. Jack threw himself into the modifications with an intensity that surprised even him. He worked 18-hour days rewiring power conduits and reconfiguring computer systems. The geothermal generators that had quietly provided electricity for his simple needs were pushed to their maximum output to feed the hungry energy requirements of their new weapon. Steam vents that had been hidden became obvious as massive amounts of power flowed through the mountain's infrastructure. Danny proved to be more than just helpful with the technical work. The 10-year-old boy had an intuitive understanding of engineering principles that amazed Jack. Danny could look at a complex system and immediately see how to make it work better or more efficiently. When Jack struggled with a particularly difficult problem, Danny would often suggest solutions that were both simpler and more effective than what the adult had planned. The boy remembered things his father had told him about electromagnetic frequencies and how different alien species reacted to various forms of energy. Dr. Peter Santos had been working on theoretical applications of his research when Haven Colony was attacked, but he had shared his ideas with his son during their long conversations about science and discovery. Danny carried those conversations in his memory and could recall details that Maria had never heard. Lisa contributed to their efforts in ways that no one expected from a 6-year-old girl. She had remarkable patience for the detailed calibration work that their weapon systems required. Her small fingers could reach into tight spaces where adult hands would not fit. Her sharp eyes could spot tiny flaws in connections or alignments that might have caused catastrophic failures when the system was activated under combat conditions. More importantly, Lisa brought a sense of hope and purpose to their work that kept everyone motivated during the long, difficult days. When Jack was frustrated with a problem that seemed impossible to solve, Lisa would remind him why they were doing this dangerous work. When Danny was exhausted from hours of calculations, Lisa would make him laugh and help him find the energy to continue. When Maria was overwhelmed by memories of her dead husband, Lisa would provide the comfort that only a loving daughter could give. Maria emerged as the natural coordinator for their increasingly complex project. She understood the scientific principles behind their weapon better than anyone except possibly Danny. She could see the tactical implications of their design choices and help them build something that would actually be effective in combat. Most importantly, she kept track of all the different components and subsystems to make sure everything would work together when the time came to use their creation. The communications array that had once simply monitored alien activity became their window into a galaxy at war. Maria spent hours each day listening to distress calls from human colonies and trying to piece together information about devourer attack patterns. The news was consistently terrible. More worlds went silent every week. Refugee ships brought stories of entire systems being consumed. The human colonial government seemed helpless to stop the advance of an enemy they did not understand. Jack found himself becoming something he had never wanted to be again. He was a military commander planning for battle. The skills he had learned during the Zephyrian Wars came back to him along with memories of friends who had died following his orders. But this time was different because this time he was not fighting for territory or resources or political goals. He was fighting for the survival of everyone he had learned to love and the continuation of human civilization itself. The weapon they were building was unlike anything that had ever been constructed before. It used the entire mountain as a resonating chamber to amplify electromagnetic frequencies to levels that could affect devourer ships across an entire star system. The power requirements were enormous, and the technical challenges were pushing human engineering to its absolute limits. But the theoretical effectiveness was beyond anything that conventional weapons could achieve. As summer progressed, their work attracted attention from the automated monitoring systems that watched human space for unusual activity. The massive energy signatures from Titan's Peak could not be hidden from sensors designed to detect alien threats. Jack began receiving coded communications from human military units, asking about the activities on his mountain. He ignored most of these messages, but he knew that eventually someone would come to investigate in person. The modifications to his fortress were becoming visible from orbit as well. Heat plumes from the upgraded geothermal systems created thermal signatures that were obvious to anyone with decent sensors. The metal framework that served as their antenna array changed the electromagnetic profile of the mountain in ways that could be detected from space. Jack's hidden refuge was becoming a landmark that announced its presence to everyone. In the new Terra system, Maria suggested that they should start reaching out to other human settlements and sharing their knowledge about fighting the Devourers. She argued that one weapon system would not be enough to stop an enemy fleet that had already consumed dozens of worlds. They needed to build a network of defensive installations that could protect the core human systems. They needed to transform their mountain fortress from a unique experiment into the foundation of humanity's survival strategy. Jack resisted this idea at first because it meant giving up the security and privacy that he had valued for 15 years. It meant trusting other people with technology that could be turned against human targets if it fell into the wrong hands. It meant accepting responsibility not just for his adopted family, but for the survival of the entire human species. The lonely mountain man who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone was being asked to become the leader of humanity's defense against an existential threat. But as he watched Danny work on calculations that would determine the optimal frequency patterns for their weapon, Jack realized that he had already made his choice. When he had carried Maria and her children up the mountain during that winter storm, he had chosen to care about someone other than himself. Everything that followed was simply the logical consequence of that first decision, to let other people into his carefully protected world. At the family that had changed his life was now helping him change the fate of human civilization. Danny's brilliant mind was solving problems that had stumped experienced engineers. Lisa's careful attention to detail was ensuring that their weapon would function reliably when needed. Maria's tactical knowledge was turning theoretical research into practical military capability, and Jack's engineering skills and combat experience were bringing it all together into something that might actually work. By the end of summer, their weapon system was nearly ready for its first test. The mountain fortress had become something unprecedented in human military history. It was a defensive installation that could project lethal force across interstellar distances. It was a research facility where the brightest minds in human space were developing new ways to fight an alien threat. Most importantly, it was a home where a family had learned to work together toward a common goal that was bigger than any of them individually. Jack stood on his observation deck and looked out at a world that had changed completely since the day 3 strangers had knocked on his door. The lonely mountain man was gone forever, and in his place stood someone who was ready to fight for the future of human civilization. The Devourer scout fleet arrived in the new Terra system on a cold morning in early autumn, when the mountain peaks were already covered with the first snows of the season. Jack's long-range sensors detected them 3 days before they would reach planetary orbit, but he could tell immediately that these ships were different from anything humans had faced before. They moved through space like living creatures, following scent trails and their energy. Signatures pulsed with rhythms that reminded him of heartbeats, and Maria was monitoring the communications networks when the first reports came in from the orbital defense stations. The human military forces in the system were scrambling to respond to the threat, but their conventional weapons and tactics had been designed to fight enemies that followed predictable patterns. The Devourers did not behave like any known species, and the standard defense protocols were proving useless against ships that seemed to ignore the basic laws of physics. Danny had been working on final calibrations for their weapon system when the alarm signals started coming through the radio. The boy looked up from his calculations with excitement rather than fear, because he understood better than anyone how their mountain fortress had been transformed. For months they had been preparing for exactly this moment, and now they would find out if all their work had been worth the effort. Lisa was less excited about the approaching battle, but she understood what it meant for their family and for all the humans living on New Terra. She helped Jack check the status displays that showed every component of their weapon system functioning within normal parameters. The 6-year-old girl had become an expert at reading the complex technical readouts that indicated whether their defenses were ready to protect the people they cared about. Jack felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and dread as he prepared for combat. He had not fought a real battle since the Zephyrian Wars ended 15 years ago, but the old instincts were still there waiting to be awakened. The difference was that this time he was not fighting alone, and he was not fighting for abstract military objectives. He was fighting to protect his family, and his home and his species against an enemy that wanted to devour everything he valued. The Devourer ships moved into orbital range around New Terra with a confidence that suggested they had never encountered serious resistance before. Their formation was loose and organic, like a school of predatory fish rather than the rigid geometric patterns that human or other alien fleets used. Jack could see why conventional weapons had been ineffective against these creatures. They did not think or move or fight like anything that military strategists had planned for. The human defense fleet engaged the Devourers with everything they had available. Missiles and energy beams and kinetic projectiles filled the space around New Terra with explosions and destruction. But the alien ships seemed to absorb the damage and convert it into energy that made them stronger and faster. What should have been a devastating first strike turned into a feeding frenzy that made the Devourers more dangerous than before. Jack watched the battle through his sensor displays and knew that the moment had come to test their secret weapon. He looked around the control room at the faces of the people who had become his family and saw determination mixed with fear. They all understood that what happened in the next few minutes would determine whether humanity had a future or whether New Terra would become another dead world drifting through space. Maria took her position at the tactical coordination station and began the final targeting sequence. The Devourer ships were spread across a wide area of space, but their weapon system had been designed to affect multiple targets simultaneously. The electromagnetic frequencies that Dr. Peter Santos had discovered would propagate through space and impact every alien vessel within range of their mountain transmitter. Danny monitored the power systems as the geothermal generators reached their maximum output and fed enormous amounts of energy into the antenna array built into Titan's Peak. The boys' calculations had determined the exact frequency patterns needed to disrupt Devourer technology, and his programming controlled the complex waveforms that would carry destruction across the vacuum between worlds. Lisa watched the status indicators that showed their weapon charging to full power. She had helped calibrate many of the smaller components, and she knew which displays to watch for signs of system failure or overload. Her small hands were ready to make emergency adjustments if any of the delicate equipment started to malfunction under the enormous stresses of combat operation. Jack initiated the firing sequence with a sense of history that he had never experienced before. This was the moment when humanity would either prove that it could defend itself against the Devourer threat or discover that their months of desperate work had been futile. The lonely mountain man who had avoided responsibility for anything beyond his own survival was about to take responsibility for the fate of his entire species. The weapon fired, with a sound that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Titan's Peak rang like a massive bell as electromagnetic energy poured out of the antenna array and raced across space toward the Devourer fleet. The frequencies that Dr. Peter Santos had died to discover filled the darkness between New Terra and its attackers with invisible forces that no human weapon had ever generated before. The effect on the Devourer ships was immediate and devastating. The organic curves of their hulls began to writhe and twist as the EM frequencies disrupted the biological processes that powered their technology. Ships that had shrugged off nuclear explosions started breaking apart as their living components died and their systems failed. The predatory school became a collection of drifting debris within minutes of the first shot. But not all of the Devourer vessels were destroyed in that first strike. The larger ships at the edge of the fleet managed to retreat beyond the effective range of the mountain weapon before the frequencies could kill them completely. They fled toward the outer system, trailing clouds of dead tissue and sparking electronics. But they were still functional and still dangerous. The human defense fleet could hardly believe what they had witnessed. Ships that had seemed invulnerable were floating, dead in space, while the source of their destruction remained hidden somewhere on the surface of New Terra. Communications channels filled with requests for information and demands to know what kind of weapon had achieved such impossible results. Jack found himself facing a choice that he had hoped to avoid. The successful test of their weapon had revealed the location of Titan's Peak to every military force in the system. Soon there would be ships arriving to investigate and officials demanding explanations. The secret fortress that had protected his privacy for 15 years was about to become the most important military installation in human space. Maria understood the implications better than anyone because she had seen what happened when the Devourers attacked colonies that were unprepared to defend themselves. One weapon system would not be enough to stop the main fleet when it arrived. They needed to share their knowledge with other worlds and help humanity build a network of defenses that could protect the entire species from extinction. Danny was already thinking about improvements and modifications that could make their weapon more effective. The boy had observed the battle through the sensor displays, and he could see ways to optimize the frequency patterns and increase the range of their transmissions. He wanted to build bigger and better versions of their mountain fortress on other worlds, where they could create overlapping fields of protection. Lisa was simply happy that their family was safe and that the scary alien ships were gone from the sky above their home. She did not fully understand the larger implications of what they had accomplished, but she could see that the adults around her were relieved and proud of what they had built together. As night fell over Titan's Peak, Jack stood once again at his observation window and looked out at a universe that had changed forever. The lonely mountain man had fired the first shot in humanity's war for survival, and there would be no going back to the simple, isolated life he had once treasured. The family that had crashed into his world during a winter storm had given him a reason to fight, and now the entire human species was depending on him to show them how to win. The victory over the Devourer scout fleet transformed Titan's Peak from a hidden fortress into the most important location in human space. Within days of the battleships began arriving from every corner of the new Terra system, carrying officials and scientists and military commanders who wanted to understand how Jack had achieved the impossible. The lonely mountain that had been home to one hermit became the center of humanity's desperate effort to survive. Jack found himself overwhelmed by the sudden attention and responsibility. For 15 years he had avoided contact with other humans, and now hundreds of people were camping on his mountain and asking him to save their entire species. The communications equipment that had once monitored distant colonies was flooded with messages from worlds across human space, begging for help and information about the new weapon that could destroy Devourer ships. Maria proved invaluable during this chaotic period because she understood both the technical aspects of their weapon and the political realities of human colonial society. She became the interface between Jack's engineering expertise and the desperate officials who needed to understand what they were dealing with. Her experience as a colony administrator helped her organize the flood of visitors and information, requests that threatened to overwhelm their small mountain fortress. Danny threw himself into the technical challenges of scaling up their weapon system for deployment on other worlds. The boy worked with visiting scientists and engineers to design manufacturing plans that could turn their unique mountain installation into a template for planetary defense networks. His understanding of the electromagnetic frequencies that harmed Devourers was deeper than anyone else's, and his ability to explain complex concepts in simple terms made him an effective teacher for the teams that would build similar weapons elsewhere. Lisa adapted to the changes in their home with the flexibility that children often show when adults around them are dealing with crises. She made friends among the visiting families and helped newcomers find their way around the expanded facilities that were being built into the mountain. Her cheerful presence reminded everyone that they were fighting not just for survival, but for the future of human children like herself. The mountain fortress underwent rapid expansion as engineering teams carved new rooms and corridors into the rock to accommodate the growing population of researchers and military personnel. The simple home that had sheltered one hermit became a complex installation with workshops and laboratories and communication centers. Geothermal taps were drilled deeper into the mountain to provide power for the expanded operations. Jack struggled with his new role as the unofficial leader of humanity's defense against the Devourers. He had never wanted command responsibility, and he was uncomfortable making decisions that would affect billions of people across dozens of worlds. But he was the only person who fully understood how their weapon worked and why it was effective against an enemy that had destroyed every human force sent against it. The first priority was building additional EM weapon installations on other worlds before the main Devourer fleet arrived in human space. Manufacturing facilities across the colonies began producing the specialized components needed to construct mountain-sized transmitter arrays. Teams of engineers and technicians traveled from world to world, carrying the knowledge and equipment needed to turn ordinary planets into fortress worlds capable of defending themselves. Maria coordinated the intelligence-gathering efforts that tried to track devourer movements and predict where the next attacks would come. The alien fleet was still consuming human colonies on the frontier, but their advance had slowed after the defeat at New Terra. The devourers seemed to be adapting their tactics and gathering information about the new human weapons that could actually harm them. Danny worked with physicists and xenobiologists to better understand how the devourers used biological processes to power their technology. His father's research had provided the initial breakthrough, but there was still much to learn about an enemy that seemed to exist at the intersection of technology and biology. The boy's insights helped human scientists develop new variations of the EM weapon that could be more effective against different types of devourer vessels. The communications networks that connected human worlds began carrying new types of messages as colonies shared information about defensive preparations and coordinated their efforts to build a unified response to the alien threat. Worlds that had been isolated and self-sufficient for generations suddenly found themselves working together toward a common goal of species survival. Jack found that leading the resistance required skills he had never developed during his years as a hermit. He had to learn to delegate authority and trust other people to carry out critical missions. He had to make strategic decisions based on incomplete information and accept responsibility for the consequences when things went wrong. Most difficult of all, he had to inspire hope in people who had seen their worlds destroyed and their families killed by an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The family dynamic that had begun with 4 people in a mountain fortress expanded to include dozens and then hundreds of individuals who had lost their homes to the devourers and found new purpose in the resistance movement. Scientists who had escaped from destroyed research facilities brought knowledge and expertise. Military personnel who had survived impossible battles brought tactical experience. Refugees from consumed worlds brought determination and motivation that could not be manufactured or trained. Lisa became a symbol of hope for the growing community on Titan's Peak. Children who had lost their parents in devourer attacks found comfort in her presence, and adults who had lost faith in the future were reminded of what they were fighting to protect. She helped organize activities and celebrations that kept morale high during the dark periods when news from the frontier was particularly bad. Danny grew from a brilliant child into something approaching a young adult as he took on responsibilities that would have challenged experienced scientists. The technical teams building new weapon installations relied on his understanding of EM frequency manipulation and his ability to troubleshoot problems that stumped older and more educated researchers. The boy who had started by helping his adoptive father fix broken equipment became one of the most important figures in humanity's technological response to the devourer threat. Maria evolved from a refugee seeking shelter into the operational commander of humanity's most important military installation. She coordinated intelligence gathering and strategic planning while maintaining the personal relationships that held their growing community together. The woman who had crashed onto Titan's Peak with nothing but her injured children had become the heart of the resistance movement. Jack discovered that his years of isolation had not prepared him for leadership, but had given him something equally valuable. He had learned to think independently and make decisions without worrying about what other people expected or demanded. This independence allowed him to see solutions that committee-bound officials missed and take actions that more conventional leaders would have been afraid to attempt. As autumn turned to winter, the first reports began arriving from other worlds where EM weapon installations had been completed. The technology that had saved New Terra was spreading across human space and giving every colony a chance to defend itself against devourer attacks. The network of fortress worlds that Danny had envisioned was becoming reality as humanity learned to fight back against an enemy that had seemed invincible. The mountain that had once hidden one man from the universe was now broadcasting humanity's defiance across the galaxy. The family that had formed during a winter storm had grown into a movement that spanned dozens of worlds. The Lonely Mountain, man who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone, had become the leader of his species. Fight for survival. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the main devourer fleet was coming to test whether humanity's new weapons would be enough to save them all. The main devourer fleet arrived in human space like a plague of living darkness that blotted out the stars themselves. The alien armada was larger than anything humanity had ever encountered, with ships that stretched for kilometers and moved through space like vast sea creatures swimming through an ocean of night. Long-range sensors detected over 3,000 vessels of various sizes approaching the core human systems with the patient hunger of predators who had never known defeat. Jack stood in the expanded command center of Titan's Peak and watched the tactical displays show humanity's desperate situation. The network of EM weapon installations that they had built across dozens of worlds represented the most ambitious military project in human history, but it had never been tested against an enemy force of this magnitude. Everything they had worked for over the past year would be decided in the next few days as the Devourers brought their full strength against the species that had dared to fight back. Maria coordinated the communications between fortress worlds as each installation reported its readiness status. The months of frantic construction had produced 47 EM weapon platforms scattered across the human colonies, with more under construction on worlds that might not finish in time to participate in the coming battle. Each platform was a unique adaptation of the Titan's Peak design, modified to work with local geography and power sources. Danny had grown into a young man during the year of preparation, and his understanding of EM warfare had evolved far beyond what his father had originally discovered. The boy who had once helped repair simple equipment now commanded teams of scientists and engineers who looked to him for solutions to problems that had never existed before. His modifications to the basic weapon design had increased both range and effectiveness while reducing the power requirements that limited deployment options. Lisa had become the emotional center of the resistance movement, as her cheerful presence and unshakable optimism reminded everyone what they were fighting to protect. At 7 years old, she was too young to understand the technical details of their weapons, but she had an intuitive grasp of human nature that helped her comfort frightened refugees and encourage exhausted workers who were pushing themselves beyond their normal limits. The battle began when the Devourer vanguard reached the outer colonies and encountered the first EM weapon installations. The aliens had learned from their defeat at New Terra and approached each fortress world with greater caution than they had shown during previous attacks. But they had not anticipated the scale of humanity's response or the improvements that Danny and his teams had made to the original weapon design. World after world lit up with electromagnetic fire as the fortress installations engaged the approaching alien fleet. The Devourers discovered that humanity had not simply copied their mountain weapon, but had created dozens of variations optimized for different tactical situations. Some platforms generated broad area effects that could disable multiple ships simultaneously, while others focused intense beams that could punch through the heaviest alien armor at extreme range. The coordination between installations proved to be as important as the weapons themselves. Maria had spent months developing communication protocols that allowed the scattered fortress worlds to act as a unified defense network rather than isolated strongpoints. When the Devourers tried to overwhelm individual installations, they found themselves caught in crossfires from platforms on neighboring worlds that could support each other across interstellar distances. Jack found himself commanding a battle that spanned multiple star systems as reports flooded in from commanders across human space. The Devourers were taking heavy losses, but they kept coming with a determination that suggested they understood this was their final opportunity to destroy humanity before the EM weapons could spread to even more worlds. The aliens threw ship after ship against the defense network in waves that seemed endless. The tide of battle shifted back and forth as individual fortress worlds were overwhelmed by concentrated attacks, while others achieved devastating victories against isolated Devourer formations. Humanity was learning to fight as a species rather than as separate colonies, and the aliens were discovering that their previous victories had been achieved against divided opponents who could not coordinate effective responses. Danny's technical innovations proved decisive during the most critical phases of the battle. His frequency modulation techniques prevented the Devourers from adapting to specific EM patterns, while his power management systems allowed the weapons to maintain sustained fire for hours without overloading. The boy who had started by understanding his father's research had become the architect of humanity's victory. Lisa played her own vital role by maintaining morale communications between the fortress worlds and the civilian populations who were depending on their defenders. Her voice became familiar to people across human space as she relayed messages between families and provided updates on the battle's progress. Children on distant worlds knew her name and found courage in her cheerful reports that made the vast conflict seem personal and manageable. The decisive moment came when the surviving Devourer ships attempted a final assault on the core human systems, including New Terra. The aliens had learned to avoid the EM weapon platforms and were trying to bypass the fortress worlds to attack undefended civilian targets. But Jack had anticipated this strategy and positioned mobile weapon platforms that could intercept the alien breakthrough attempt. The Battle of New Terra lasted 3 days as the Devourer fleet threw everything they had against the birthplace of human resistance. Wave after wave of alien ships crashed against the combined fire of Titan's Peak and the orbital platforms that Danny had designed to extend the mountain weapon's effective range. The space around New Terra became a graveyard of alien vessels, as humanity fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction. When the last Devourer ship was destroyed or driven from human space, the silence that followed seemed unnatural after months of constant battle. The species that had consumed dozens of worlds and billions of lives was finally gone from the galaxy, and humanity had survived its greatest test. The victory had been costly, with several fortress worlds destroyed and thousands of brave defenders lost, but the human species would continue to exist among the stars. In the aftermath of victory, Jack found himself appointed as the Supreme Commander of the Colonial Defense Force, with responsibility for preventing future threats to human space. The hermit, who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone, had become the most important military leader in human history, and he discovered that he was comfortable with the responsibility because it meant protecting the people he had learned to care about. Maria became the civilian administrator for the expanded fortress network as the EM weapon installations were converted from emergency war measures into permanent defensive systems. Her experience coordinating the resistance made her the natural choice to manage the complex logistics of maintaining planetary defense platforms across dozens of worlds. She ensured that the weapons built to fight the Devourers would be ready to face whatever threats might emerge from the unknown regions of space. Danny grew up to become humanity's leading expert on defensive technology as he continued developing new applications for electromagnetic warfare and exploring other ways that human science could protect the colonies from alien threats. The brilliant child who had helped save his species became the man who would ensure that humanity never again faced extinction because it was unprepared to defend itself. Lisa became humanity's first interspecies diplomat as her childhood experiences with the resistance movement prepared her to understand both human nature and alien psychology. Her natural empathy and communication skills made her the ideal representative for humanity as the species began exploring peaceful contact with other civilizations that had also survived encounters with the Devourers. The mountain fortress on Titan's Peak remained as the headquarters of human defense and the home of the family that had changed the course of galactic history. Jack and Maria married in a simple ceremony attended by representatives from every human world, and their partnership became the foundation for humanity's golden age of expansion and exploration. The children who had knocked on a hermit's door during a winter storm had grown into the leaders of a civilization that spanned the stars. Years later, when Jack stood once again at his observation window and looked out at the lights of the thriving settlement that had grown around his mountain home, he remembered the lonely man who had once believed that isolation was the only path to safety. The family that had crashed into his life had taught him that the greatest strength came not from hiding from the universe but from building connections with others who shared his hopes and dreams and determination to create a better future. The lonely mountain man had learned the most important lesson of all. Home was not a place you built to keep the world out. Home was the people you chose to let in.